Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Lara Krawchuk. Lara is a licensed therapist and the owner and clinical director at Healing Concepts, a private practice dedicated to excellence in private practice, or in clinical practice, Lara received her Master of Social Work from the University of Pennsylvania, her Master of Public Health from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and has over 30 years of social work experience with individuals, couples, families, and organizations. Lara has worked extensively in several different settings, including hospital, hospice, cancer wellness, university, and private practice settings. For over 20 years, Lara has served as an adjunct lecturer for the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice, and she currently teaches IFS-inspired social work, loss across the lifestyle, and advanced clinical practice classes to MSW students. Lara writes and lectures nationally on issues of caregiving, compassion fatigue, creative healing, end of life, grief and loss, guided imagery, and impact of illness on the family. Lara believes in helping individuals, couples, families, and organizations rediscover and shape the stories of their lives by safely exploring strengths, hurts, challenges, and opportunities woven throughout. So, Lara, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thanks, Jalon. It's thrilled to be here.
I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today?
Sure. I am a therapist who came to it really through the hospitals. I had a friend of the family when I was young who had breast cancer, and my mother really journeyed with her throughout. So I saw her when she was good, and I saw her struggle, and I saw her move towards the end of life and then die. And her sons were friends of mine, close to my age, and one really struggled. And I remember thinking then that we never really talked about the hard stuff. And maybe if we had, maybe the struggle would have been less. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I think that was the birth of the idea of what I do now. Also, even before I was born, I have significant parts who are impacted by the legacy of my people. And there's a lot of loss back there. So I joke, but I'm not really joking, that I was born to do this work. And I've been pretty consistent in saying that now for over 30 years. So I do believe I was born to work with grieving people and with living losses as well.
Thank you for sharing that. I do think it's very true that we don't talk about the hard stuff often. Like we will be in a setting where a family member or someone close to us is dying, and there'll just be this elephant in the room, and nobody wants to look at it, nobody wants to talk about it, and I think that can give us a lot to carry after the fact. And even then, we still don't talk about it. So it's very important what you do. So thank you for what you do.
I'm lucky to do it. It's an honor.
I'm glad you feel that way. I do want to spend a little time focusing on you and who you are and how you've grown and evolved as a clinician so that the audience can really get to know you. And then we can get into the interview. You've been a therapist for a long time. Was there anything in particular that inspired you to pursue your career in therapy? And was there any other personal experiences that influenced your decision?
Yeah. So, all of the being born to do it, my friend's mom. I also my father was a cardiologist, so hospitals were really comfortable places for me, which seems odd to many, but for me, it made sense. So it was natural that I moved towards healthcare in the start of my career. Um, and then later in my career, as I got going, I was doing oncology social work, which was very much what I wanted to do. And my own father got cancer. So we went through our own journey as a family through years of really terrible illness and then grief and loss. So I've lived what I do in some respects as well, which with this population is really helpful.
I was going to say, in order to help somebody, being able to relate to their experience can be very helpful. And, it can also be a two-edged sword, because having to lose someone to be able to help someone can be, um, a tough door to walk through to be able to do what you do better.
Yeah.
But then also it does give you, kind of the tools to be equipped for how you need to help people.
Yes, it's the both and, right? That's a
Hmm.
theme in grief and loss. It's both a gift and a challenge.
Exactly.
Mhm.
What was early life like for you? And did your childhood or family have anything to do with your choice of becoming this particular type of therapist, or um, specializing in what you do now? Was that something early on as well?
Yeah, well, actually, my father, who probably was the reason that I could do what I do, wanted me to go into business.
Mm.
So he was horrified at first that I would go into social work. He didn't understand it. And in a twist of fate, one of my first jobs was working for his practice. So he got it after that and was one of my great cheerleaders. I think that my uh, family legacy of helping people comes from my mother, who was a teacher and a reading specialist, and also just really an informal social worker. She was into helping people and issues of justice and things like that. And though I think she didn't get enough credit for how influential that is, Mom, I'm giving you the credit now because she really deserves that and probably put me on the path towards doing what I do and was extremely supportive of it from the get go.
That's great.
Was lucky. I had a beautiful life in many ways, and I'm grateful for that. It maybe it sets me up to have a lot to offer and be able to hold a lot. The pain for us came later when Dad got so sick.
Mm.
Yeah.
You also work at the University of Pennsylvania School for Social Policy and Practice. What's that like?
Whew. It's a gift and it's intense. Our students are so bright and they push us for excellence. Penn SP2, as we call the School of Social Policy and Practice, it has been, oh gosh, my greatest champion, and allowed me to teach these two electives, loss across a life cycle and IFS inspired social work. I mean, that is so fun for me and exciting. There's nothing I love more than teaching new social workers how to be comfortable with grief and loss. And then because I'm just such a lover of IFS, how to use this beautiful model safely in really diverse practice settings. So not all social workers are doing therapy like I'm doing. And so they are spread out all over the city of Philadelphia and beyond to working in homeless shelters, working with people who are unhoused, working with people who have just gotten here from war zones, working with people who are incarcerated, working in cancer centers, working with children who are facing brain tumors. I mean, you name it, they are working with it. And to be able to help them have these tools to feel comfortable in the realm of grief and loss. And then this overarching umbrella of IFS and working with parts and helping people discover self-leadership. It's it's a magnificent gift that SB2 has given me and continues to give me.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. I want to ask a question about social work because when I think of a social worker, um, I guess maybe from movies or television or what have you, I think of someone who's showing up um, in maybe an underdeveloped area to check on someone's kids and possibly take them away if they're not, maintaining a certain level of care or cleanliness or what have you. And it seems that that is not um, the picture of social work that you do.
No, I certainly have never done anything close to that kind of work, and I think it's a fair argument to say there's been some problematic aspects of social work.
Mm.
But I think that sadly, and you're right, media is shows mostly that. But social workers are the unsung heroes in so many agencies. They help people when they're struggling. They're helping people when they're hurting, and they're dedicated to social justice. And so they're really magnificent humans, and they should not be feared. They should be welcomed if it's right for you, if you need support, but certainly given a chance. And certainly, the kind of social work I do is much more healthcare related. And that is why I got my public health degree, because I really wanted to be part of fixing healthcare and then realized I really don't have the patience for politics. So I didn't do that. But I believe in it. And so we are doing so many things. I think of hospice social workers who are out there literally holding the hands and feet of people who are dying and then supporting their loved ones, including their children after. And this is really heroic work, and it breaks my heart that media has so poorly portrayed us, uh, because we're so vast and diverse. And actually, that's one of the challenges in teaching. I teach an advanced clinical practice class, and trying to meet all the needs in the room can be, wow, quite a challenge.
Mm.
But it's an exceedingly diverse field and some really, truly magnificent people who are um, out there every day doing what they do and fighting to help people uh, with little and few resources
Mm.
often.
With the weight of your client struggles, it seems like maybe you could bring that stuff home with you or it could get sticky. Like, are you exempt from feeling your client struggles?
No,
No.
um, I feel my clients' struggles deeply. And I think this is an important part of any helping profession, really knowing what you can do and not have it break you. It's a skill that we teach social work students to try to recognize when they're hurting because of their clients, how to recognize if, say, they're ruminating at home, and but they learn what vicarious trauma is, so we can get impacted by the trauma of other people and what we see and things like that. We can certainly be harmed by agencies who do not adequately support us, which happens sadly a lot in not for profits and for profits. And so we are not exempt. For me, I was born to do this work. I love it. I can feel someone's sorrow. I was just talking to a client about this literally this week. I can feel the sorrow. They were apologizing because their story is big and they were worried that it was hard for me to hear. And I said, I can feel your pain. I can be with it. I can witness it deeply. I can help sometimes. And sometimes I even cry with my clients in session. I do a lot with mother loss, and I have children, often the same age as theirs, that died. Um, So yeah, it hurts. And also, I have the capacity in this kind of work to differentiate between work and home and to be deeply appreciative of the life I've built with my family. and to differentiate that. So most times I'm okay. Um, now do almost all trauma and traumatic loss. So sometimes the cumulativeness of it starts to get to me. So I do encourage people to take as much time off as they need. And for me, I really need a block of time to step away for a week or so. Um, I do retreats and things like that, and classes and conferences. I also teach, so I've got a bit of a balance of different things. But we are not exempt, and it's a very serious problem in social work. We have a lot of burnout. Very often, it's about the agencies and the lack of resources, uh, much like the clients we're trying to serve, um, not the client's stories or their sadness or their anger or their frustration or anything like that. Social workers typically, if they're in the right field, right? So sometimes people have to move around till they find the right one, or sometimes, for instance, people working with um, cancer centers with who see children. If they have children, they feel like they need a break from that. Um, so there can be an ebb and flow. I stepped away from oncology for a little bit after my dad died. It was too much, and then very soon thereafter, my soul came calling for me again, and I went back to it. So yeah, we are impacted. Absolutely. Absolutely.
You mentioned something, vicarious trauma, and the first thing I thought was like secondhand smoke.
Hmm.
And I would think that for most people, if they can, feel the energy of the moment, that if they don't have the proper tools or know how to regulate their emotions, that they would feel it a lot more. But even as a therapist, knowing these things, you still feel it too.
Oh, you absolutely feel it. And you know, newsflash, sometimes we get into the work because of our own stuff.
Mm,
And so sometimes we have not done enough with our exiles, with our pain. And so that can be quite a challenge. I try to help students identify if that's happening early in their career. No shame, no judgment, but it is a little like heads up that you need to perhaps get a therapist, do some work, professional consultation. I do that all the time with uh, helpers that are hurting.
mm.
Um, but somehow it needs to be addressed or it will get into the work or make you really vulnerable for vicarious trauma.
Do you find that a lot of helpers, as you call them, will go into this field because they are trying to help other people because of their own pain that they may be avoiding?
I'm not sure I would say they're always avoiding it. It can happen.
Hmm.
But I think sometimes they underestimate how much more needs to be done. They think they're done or something like that. And so I'm definitely a professor who shares my story a lot to show that the struggle can be cyclical, can be different waves of it, and that we always need to be cognizant of those hurting parts, grieving parts. It's one of the things I love about IFS is that in learning the model, you're really working on your stuff, and it just normalizes that. And so, yeah, I definitely think it's an important thing. But no, not everyone's avoiding their pain. They're just unaware that if you're sitting with a client that pulls for it, that might actually be a serious impact on you.
I see. So you started your own private practice called Healing Concepts. How did that come to be? And were there any challenges that you faced along the way in starting your practice?
Um, yeah, yes. There, uh, it came to be very simply. I Turns out I like to be, a lady boss. I like to
Mm,
be my own boss, much much like my father in these ways. And so I I was working for a large group practice who I still love, but I really felt the call to be my own boss. And part of that was I'd been through a lot. My dad had been so sick. I'd had two children while my dad was so sick and dying and then died. And so I had babies, I'm grieving. And I just felt that I needed the flexibility to maybe work less hours, have control over my hours, be able to take time if I needed time, either for my family or for my grief or both. Um, and I also started to wonder, like, am I leaving something on the table? Could I be more creative? Could I do different things if I do it this way? So I left the group practice with their support. They've always been great supporters of mine. I love them. And started my little teeny practice for a while because I was really hurting. And I had two young children. It was very part time. And then one of my psychologist friends who I rented space from, uh, something they were using as a closet. Uh, and he said, "You're going to be busier than you can imagine soon enough. So you better have a plan for that." So that's what happened. That's the challenge, is that if you're pretty good at what you do and you love it, soon enough you will have lots of clients. And it's hard to say no. Turns out my no part was really turned off. My yes part was very extreme and hulked out. And so I started to build the team. So now I have 6 contractors who work for me, who are also specialists in grief and loss and love IFS and love working with trauma. So, um, but even that's the challenge, right? Navigating, owning the practice and running the practice, and making sure we have enough referrals so that people are making the living that they deserve to make. And I just went on vacation, but I still had to do practice admin stuff. So um, it that kind of thing can be really challenging when you go out on your own, and people struggle with it a lot.
Well, I'm glad you made the choice to go out on your own and that your practice is now um, thriving and that you're able to help people in a even bigger way since you have your own practice. How many types of therapy do you incorporate in your practice? And is there a particular type of therapy that you prefer most? And if so, why?
Yes, I would say that I am very much an IFS practitioner, internal family systems. Funny story. The very first day I moved from hospital center, cancer centers, hospice to become a therapist, I was like, I don't know how to do therapy. But they said, yes, if you do hospice talks at bedside and that's your like forte, that's what you're best at, you're going to be fine. So they took a risk. And they said, "Oh, this guy is coming to talk to us about his new model of therapy." And I was like, "Okay, well, I need some models because I don't have any." Penn wasn't a very clinical program back then; it is now, and so yeah, I'll go to this day long training. Who's the guy? I don't know. His name is Dick Schwartz. He's doing this thing called IFS. So I go, and I'm just like, wow, this is awesome. So, and then half the room, the half that used very different models, didn't like it at all. And so I very quickly knew I'm not going to be a CBT therapist. I'm going to be whatever this thing called IFS is. That was day one. But then a part said, "You're not ready for it. It seems advanced." So I went into narrative work, constructivist work, which is all about witnessing people's stories. I became a follower of Robert Niemeyer, who is now a dear friend, and I work for at his Portland Institute for Loss and Transition, just an incredible training program for grief and loss. He did a lot with what's called meaning making, or sense making and meaning reconstruction, which is the empirically validated grief and loss model. They did a lot of research. And so I followed his work, learned everything I could learn, read everything I could read, eventually created a class based on that work. So I work a lot. My overarching umbrella is IFS and meaning making, which in a nutshell, I believe I'm doing meaning making with the individual parts while following the IFS model. I mostly work that way. I weave in, you can't quite tell, but I'm sitting in my art studio. So we're art inspired therapists. We have lots of art supplies, and often I sit with people while they do art and then they do IFS and meaning making. I am very somatically oriented. So I'm a big fan of Susan McConnell's work, and Pat Ogden's work. Janina Fisher can be somatic as well. My team loves EMDR and mindfulness, and they do some ACT and some DBT. So, but for me, everything that my clients need can be covered with narrative, meaning making, IFS, somatic practices, and a little bit of art.
So you decided to venture out on your own. You stumble into IFS. You have this training with the founder of the model. If someone has no clue who Dick Schwartz is or what IFS is, and they're a little bit lost in this conversation, how would you explain to them what you were learning and what the model is?
I start with Cookie Monster.
Hmm.
So I think maybe almost all of us have had some sort of experience with wanting a treat and standing at the treat and having sort of a debate with ourselves about whether we should have 10 cookies or have a salad or walk away entirely and take a run instead or something. We've all had this version, right? Replace cookies with something else if you like. But we have these internal dialogues all the time. And our partner might make us mad. And one part wants to, make a fuss, get our finger out. And the other part might be thinking, like, well, they're having a bad day. They're struggling. So, welcome to our parts, right? We all have them. We know that because we do talk to ourselves.
Hmm.
and and that's okay and it's normal. So, usually I use a little humor. We kind of talk about that. People, oh, okay. All right, that sounds manageable. And little by little, I layer in the idea that some parts are protecting us. Some parts that carry great pain have been pushed away because the system feels they must keep the pain away. And then we have this inner healer that we call true self. And we're born with it. And it's interconnected to all things in the universe. And most people can lean into that a little bit. And then I have them try it. And so I'm a teacher, I'm a professor. So I teach them through it, right? And we just ask questions. And some people are like ducks to water. They just know how to do it. And they've kind of been waiting for it. Um, Truthfully, many people come in having listened to podcasts and things like that, hopefully yours, and having learned things. And And then some people struggle with it. Their cognitive parts really want to take over. They've been really successful using other models that are more cognitive. And then we just slow it down, respect that. But eventually, all my clients are doing IFS, even the ones that came in with parts that were just like, no way. So it's not as tricky as people think.
I love the illustration of Cookie Monster that you gave. Um, is there or was there difficulty for you learning and accepting the model when you first heard it? Or, I mean, you said you gravitated to it, but how did it affect your system?
It felt like relief,
Hmm.
particularly because I have parts that are burdened with legacy burden that felt like maybe not even my story. They're intergenerational. And so it felt like a relief to understand my parts who were very active in my system and maybe causing some troubles, that they were trying to help and that they protected things was very helpful to me. Um, it was monumental in my marriage because we now both talk about IFS and we talk, I call them parts, my spouse calls them peeps. And and that felt so helpful. Um, and so also it helps. I mean, once you start using IFS and you see the beauty of it for clients and how much they can heal, I was so hooked after that. But for me, the challenging part was true self, um, because I had some concerns about not being taught a spirituality or a religion or something like that. It's not, but I needed to get through that concern. I, I can't see energy. I can't prove true self really, although in my system it feels so true and that's enough for me. Um, and so I had to struggle with feeling out how how self energy opens for me. And that was a bit of a challenge for me because, I'm a professor, so I can be like, little cognitive, prove it parts. So yeah, that one was a little tough, but I got there.
Now you managed to integrate IFS and grief work together, and I want to talk a little bit more about grief in particular. And I want to ask a simple question, like, what is grief?
Grief is the natural, normal, and expectable reaction to loss. That might be a death, or it might be a breakup, or it might be witnessing violence or horror on the TV. In the world that we're living in, it might be related to what is coming, say climate change. People grieve that. It could be this is the college application time for some of us. It could be a grief about the loss of not getting to the place that you want or getting in and not being able to afford to go. Or so there are both death related losses, dying related losses, and living or non finite losses. Some losses are really clear, some losses are ambiguous. For instance, if someone you love goes to jail, that's an ambiguous loss. They're alive, you can talk to them, but you can't really access them. They're not free. And so there could be losses all the way around in that. And that there are also something called disenfranchised losses, which leads to disenfranchised grief, where grief gets pushed away by other people's parts or our own parts.
I've heard that there are stages to grief. Can you explain the stages of grief and whether everyone experiences them the same way?
Yes, I'm not a believer in the stages of grief.
Okay.
They have been not empirically proven repeatedly. They're popular for many reasons, but they're also problematic because they're, first of all, they don't work the way they're it's not as advertised. Um,
Okay.
and because they're so prevalent, people really think they should be following that. And when they inevitably do not, they then feel less than or wrong, or they pathologize themselves, or worse, other professionals or other people pathologize them. So I struggle with the stages. I won't teach them in my classes. I really encourage people to check out other models. But for some people, the stages of grief are a framework that helps them understand themselves. So if my clients' parts are drawn to the stages, then we run with that. And I just try to broaden the lens a bit. Um, there's a new stage called meaning making that actually existed long before it was added to the stages. And those incredible researchers and clinicians, Bob Niemeyer included, deserve a debt of gratitude for all of that. So, no, people do not follow the stages, and that is totally okay, normal, and expectable. And there's nothing, and I think that there's a lot of correcting this in the communities who do follow the stages of grief, which is great. There's nothing neat about grief and loss. And remember, I specialize in traumatic loss, so they really don't tend to follow the stages.
Mm.
For many of them, the word acceptance is harmful, hurtful, and offensive. And for my system does not like the word acceptance. It does not accept. It is absolutely healed from grief. I'm okay that my father has died 18 years ago. I'm okay that I don't have access to him in the same way, though I have a continued bond with his essence or his true self. But I don't accept the suffering and the torture that the cancer did to him, gave to him. And I never will. I don't accept that it all happened when I was pregnant. He almost died the first pregnancy. He did die just before the second one was born. So that took me out of enjoying my children and them having the mother they deserved. All the while, this was with extreme pain, and he lost his personality, had brain tumors. I don't accept. So to use that language and make that be the goal or to normalize it for my system is not workable. And that's the case for many of my clients.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think that could bring a lot of relief to so many people. Like, because I don't accept the way my father died either. And I think having to is somewhat of an injustice, because you have to kind of move on and avoid what you're really feeling so that you can feel the way you're supposed to.
That's right. Well said.
Hmm.
I do think it is a relief to many to realize, like, oh, they're not doing it wrong. And in
Hmm.
fact, a large part of the grief community has been questioning the stages for a long time. So it, that's what's tricky, right? What's popular versus what's true for me. So I really want to encourage people to really honor whatever parts are up around grief and not to question that.
Speaking of acceptance and having to do things that we may not necessarily feel okay doing, can cultural and familial backgrounds influence a person's grieving process?
Oh, yes, 150%. So one of the things you want to get curious about is what are the cultural norms that I am influenced by? Are they working for me? Are they not working for me? Or am I being expected to do something that does not fit for me? Or is it um, a comfort? And that could be family culture all the way to neighborhood culture, larger culture, historical culture. Um, so all of it matters. Um, and so grief, anybody working with grief should be really comfortable just asking. I do understand that people should not have to teach you their cultures, but in this case, asking about culture, are there things about your culture that it would be helpful for me to know, that have been helpful, that have been challenging, that you don't understand? Sometimes I'll send people to religious leaders in their community because they have questions that I can't answer because I'm not from that community. There's a lot of good collaboration when you do grief work. But also, I work with many people who were going along saying they were really involved in their religious community, for instance, and they were a leader in their community. And all of a sudden, they had this massive loss, and things that they thought were true, they're now questioning, and the community doesn't like that.
Hmm.
And so sometimes we have to talk about that kind of harm, and that's really sensitive work. And it's not my business to weigh it, to pick a side. It's my business to witness what the parts are struggling with.
I like the
And
way that
that's
you,
meaning making.
yeah, it is. I think meaning making is also something really big for people, because if your culture or your family has said this means this and you can't question it, like, you still have so many unresolved things that you have to sit with and move forward and, put a smile on your face and pretend like you're not feeling those feelings. And they could be huge feelings that you're having to suppress.
That's right. And then you're forced to exile them. So
Mm,
I always tell, sometimes I get asked, what's different about IFS and grief? And in some ways, it's about preventing new exiles because there's so much pressure to be a certain way. It's coming from every direction. We can't meet that need. And then our system, our helpful protector parts say, just like, we'll get it out of here. And
mm,
so that's really harmful. And I think that exiled grief has some really angry protectors, and can be very destructive protectors. And when you scratch the surface of that kind of destructive behavior, activated parts, you almost always find deep wells of some kind of grief and trauma, and they go together often. And so, yeah, it's really meaning making. People are like, what is meaning making?
mm.
First, it's questioning. What happened? Why did it happen? Why did it happen to me? Why did it happen in that way? Why did it happen to a person I love? Why did it happen when I was pregnant? Why? Why? Then it's sense making. Little bit of answers start to come. Maybe the answer is like, well, life is not fair. I mean, it doesn't have to be pretty, but you're making sense of the loss. You're working with all the parts related to how it doesn't make sense. You're honoring them. And then you're making sense of, who am I now? Where am I going? Am I still a mother if my only child was murdered? This takes time, right? Once you've done that very slow, painful work, then people move into meaning reconstruction. And that's simply reconstructing a meaningful life with grief being part of it.
You mentioned an exile. Can you explain what an exile is and how it can be created?
Exiles, to me, are parts who got the hard job of being most impacted by whatever the painful thing is. And there's a continuum. That could be a lack of attunement, it could be neglect, it could be abuse, it could be a giant loss, it could be an illness, a learning disability, being bullied. But this part, they're often young. So we all have exiles from being young. But then in the case of an illness like cancer or a brain tumor or an accident or death, we might have these potential exiles as adults too, right? It's whatever that part that feels the pain, the horror, the terror, the loneliness the most, that has potential to be an exile. What makes an exile is when protective parts decide you're too much for the system, or outsiders decide that, right? You're not accepting, so therefore you're talking about this too much. You haven't moved on. Then that poor part that's holding lots of pain now has the double pain of being sent away, sort of locked out.
Wow.
But they're not gone, so they're in there keening and crying and making a lot of noise, which activates we call them protectors. Right? So now
How?
you have to have more wine so it stops crying,
Mhm,
or eat more cookies, or stop
mm,
eating, or be angry, be volatile, be fighting with everyone you know.
mm. My next question was going to be, how can this affect someone's mental and emotional health?
In so many ways. First of all, broken heart syndrome is real. Hearts get impacted by grief. It stresses the hearts. It sends out a ton of stress hormones, and that can impact the heart. At the worst case scenario with a heart attack, but very often it's more about inflammation and it's not a heart attack. So when people tell me I am having a lot of chest pain, I don't say like that's grief. I say let's do a rule out with your doctor. And then if that's okay, let's talk grief. So yeah, this happened in my own family and it's shocking. And so grief can have a literal impact. My system gained all kinds of weight after grief. And I needed a ton of sweetness somehow. So I ate a ton of Juji fruits and M&Ms. uh, that had long-term repercussions that I'm still dealing with. And so, but it was grief. And so people talk about headaches, neck aches, muscle soreness. Grief impacts us at every level of our system, emotionally, physically, spiritually, relationally. It impacts work. And yep, society says like, it's been 2 days. Come on, let's go.
All right, that part. Thank you so much for going in depth with that. And I think that is so validating for so many reasons and so many things that you mentioned. I wanted to ask a question about the system. Which part of a person's system tend to be most activated when they are grieving?
This is where every person who's grieving is different. So whatever your tendency was before will be more in spades more often than not. So if you were a person who liked to crawl under the covers and hide, you might be doing a lot of that. If you were a person prone to having angry parts in the lead, you might be doing that. If you are a person who tries to avoid pain, you might be at risk for some substance use to try to numb it. And sadly, the healthcare industry is far too willing to give those medications. So I have lots of grieving clients who have been given on hello lots of medications. I'm not against it, but I don't think that's the first line. First, we get curious about why the medication's needed, and work with those parts. If you're an anxious person, your anxious parts might be up. One of the tricky parts about grief, where IFS is really, really helpful, is a new loss often braids together with old exile losses. So all of a sudden now you're doing this and you're doing these 4 other things that were hard. And so some of what we're doing is like reminding parts, present, past.
How do you help your clients using IFS to heal the exile parts related to grief? And can you provide some examples of how an exile part might be tied together with a grief memory?
Yeah, I tend to think more in terms of holding exiles who are grieving. The idea of unburdening grieving exiles, grieving a current loss, is a little bit tricky for me. So instead, again, I'm trying to prevent a new exile by just holding that part's pain, witnessing it, giving it a gentle place to be. So many of my clients, and this is a compliment, say, you're the place where I get the saddest. You're my unhappy place. One of my clients, beloved client this week, said, wait, this was no good today. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Why? It was too, I was happy. It was okay. That's not what I do here. So now I didn't get my chance to be really, really, really unhappy. So we actually extended 10 minutes and let that part know like it wasn't being exiled. It could be here and this person could have a good day. So there's a lot of both and helping the parts learn what we call in the grief world the dual process model, which is honoring the loss, the pain, the tough stuff, I call it, and then shifting to either everyday stuff or even some good stuff. Healthy grievers oscillate, which means that the parts need to work as a team and not exile the tough stuff. Then more traditional IFS sometimes, and you have to time this right because to go into the old stuff, the old exiled stuff that hasn't been healed from the past, while someone's grieving a current loss might be just too much.
Mm.
So sometimes inexperienced grief counselors do that, and then now they've flooded the system with too much stuff. So, but sometimes a new loss opens up old losses, and then we go to the exile, we witness it, and there can be unburdening in those. Is that answering your question?
It is. What I was going to ask, let's say someone's listening and they say, okay, so in order for me to heal my pain, do I have to go and sit with someone and be unhappy and then feel all those feelings?
If you're the helper,
If you're
or
the
if you're,
client.
it, do you have to feel all those feelings? There's no way around grief.
Mm.
It you can take breaks for sure. Not everyone feels intensity in the same way with grief. So not everyone is, a puddle. Not everyone is reeling. Some people are okay. But for those who are reeling, and I was one of those people, yes, you do have to be with those parts somehow. That's why we have the art studio, because sometimes words are too much, journaling too much, going inside and meditating intolerable, but they can speak through the art or movement. I hiked my way through grief.
So, for example, let's say a mother lost her son, but she didn't have the time or ability to stop working and stop living, and she just had to be business as usual.
Yeah.
And now she comes to see you maybe 3 years later. She's at that point going to have to now revisit all that and sit in that pain in order to get through it.
It it won't be the same because all the things she's learned along the way will support her ability to do this. But I'm assuming if she's come to me that she's struggling. So that exiled grief that was exiled because our society does not give time for grief. And so many people from so many communities are forced to return to their lives too quickly.
Mm.
And that's it. That there's little support. They're told to move on. They're told the fallacy that grief is done in 6 months. That's a lie. And so, yes, in order for that mother to heal the loss of a child, we're going to have to go to that exile and safely and in a safely titrated way witness it, lend exquisite presence, and eventually help some of the burdens lift. And that doesn't mean she's totally fine and that the grief doesn't matter or that she doesn't have pain, but she will have access to self-led grieving. That feels quite different.
So, for someone who didn't have an opportunity to grieve, are there parts like protectors that would come in and play a role to allow that grief to be suppressed?
Yeah, absolutely. I once had a client who was in their 70s who came to me for the death of a spouse, riddled with anxiety all their lives. So they're like, I have an anxiety disorder. Um, we got curious about the anxiety. Turns out they were not there for the spouse. They were there for the loss of a parent when they were 6. And the other parent got remarried. The step parent didn't ever want to hear about it or even hear the name of the person who died ever again. They had massive exiles. Well, anxiety was very distracting. So they were just riddled with anxiety at all times. Once we started to go to the young grieving exile, the anxiety settled down. Other clients, the drinking stops, the fighting stops, they rage slows down or right sizes. It's incredibly potent work.
Well, it sounds so. Um, how can IFS help someone feeling overwhelmed by grief to being able to hold space for it, like in a not just one particular instance? Maybe it's not the death of a loved one, or just in general.
The key to healthy grieving is going there and shifting, take away from it, taking breaks. and then going there and then shifting and taking a break. In early, certainly death-related loss of one of your, most important people, it feels impossible to take a break at all for many
Mm.
people. So we have to teach them, like, maybe gentle stretching is the only break you're going to get, right? As it might be very small, short. But we do a lot of work on what is an acceptable break for your parts who are grieving. And then they're going to pull you right back because they need you a lot. Over time, that shift is more, right? There might be a whole hour, then a day, then a few days where you weren't riddled with pain. And then along comes an anniversary and you're right back there. And so it's a lot about partnership among the parts. So, like, I think Cease Sykes came up with the conference table. Like, all parts are truly welcome. Like, with grief, all parts are truly needed. So, like, my sad parts were welcome and my hiking parts were welcome. And when I was hiking, I wasn't as sad. Or sometimes they hiked together. I did a lot of crying on the trails. And, like, my my sad and angry, I was so angry about how the illness had taken him because it was just riddled with pain and it was intolerable. Torture pain. It was so painful. I was real mad about that. So those angry parts were welcome, and my mothering a young child part without anger parts were welcome, right? And we had to take turns sometimes. And that took, I tend to use the fire pit. So, like, there's the fire, that self, give us some good energy, and then everybody's around the fire pit, and we can sit far away from our frenemy. But we're all there, and we can come up with a plan for collaboratively working through this enormous loss. Same for living losses.
Okay. Is there a way that you can assess when a client is ready to start doing grief work?
They're always ready. I learned this from my clients. They're ready when they show up for support. And who's often not ready is those they show up to get the support from. So I had a couple people early in my private practice show up 2 weeks after a suicide, overdose, accident, and a murder. These were different clients.
Oh, okay.
Took their children, and they showed up
Oh.
2 weeks later for help. And I was like, whoa, how could we even go there at all? Like, it's going to totally overwhelm them. But it did not. My job was to titrate things and to help them do a little shift and then do this again, right? Hit repeat, hit repeat. Turns out they were so healthy to come early. But it's also not too late if you waited 70 years. It's not too late.
I think the earlier someone can come shows a willingness to heal on their part, and maybe not a desire to not have to sit in the pain. They're looking for relief, I would say.
They are often they have a part that's looking for relief and actually thinks I have a magic wand that we're going to bypass grief.
I see.
Sometimes their parts are doing that. Sometimes their parts are resisting the outside pressure to be, fine, get back to it. And so that is great. We cheerlead for that in my office, but sometimes they're there because I am going to have and they often admit this down the road, some magical answer because I'm, the Philadelphia grief person. Yeah, I wish. My parts grieve hard, so, like, that'd be nice, but I haven't figured that one out yet. But I know I can be with you and exquisitely witness and help your parts find ways to go forward in the midst of grief.
So using IFS, how does IFS enable individuals to not only grieve, but also honor their lost loved ones in a meaningful way?
In so many ways. One is we work with the parts who want to build legacy memories, who want to honor their loved ones, and we we help them plan, and help them assess readiness, for instance. So I do a lot with suicide loss, and parents are often wondering, should I go to the walk? Right? The walk was actually this month. Should I go? Can I handle it? What would it be like? So we work with the part that wants to go and the part that doesn't want to go first, and just like all perspectives welcome. It's my job to help all perspectives stay welcome so one doesn't take over for the other. And then we can engage a cognitive or a planner part to like, okay, let's plan the day. And that can be enormously helpful. So, we can be very pragmatic in this work.
I think you've given so many tools and so much encouraging advice. Let's say someone is listening to this episode and now they're ready to find a therapist based on this conversation. What advice would you give someone who's looking for a therapist who specializes in grief and IFS?
You can go to the IFS Institute website and their therapist and professionals, professional practitioner directories. You're going to have to do some detective work, go onto the websites, get a sense of if grief is a specialty. Almost every therapist will mark that they do grief. So but you want to look for a little more clues that they really love working with grief, either some blogs or something that shows you they really work with grief a lot. If that's not clear, just ask them, how often do you work with grief? Would you consider that one of your specialties? Why? What do you think about the stages is a good way to say like that. If that's all they know, then they haven't been doing much training in grief and loss. And so that's for the IFS, that's one way. Association for Death Education and Counseling, it's called ADEC. ADEC has a therapist finder feature too. So they're grief experts. They might not be IFS experts. Local hospices may know good people. They also often have bereavement coordinators that sometimes have groups or services for the community. And Centers for Grieving Children. I'm on the board of Peter's Place in Radnor, PA. They're phenomenal, and they keep resource lists. I know lots of good therapists in the Pennsylvania, probably Delaware and New Jersey areas. There are Centers for Grieving Families and Children and Families all across the U.S. So, like, you could find one of that's be a great place to start. Melding the two tricky things to get at once is a lot. So like IFS plus grief, I don't know, we do that. It can be hard to find both specialties, but a good IFS therapist with some grief training or just an openness to grief could be great.
Thank you for that. Thank you for being so honest. And you can really tell that you're seasoned in what you do and that you really love to do it. And I want to build off that with a personal question for you. And that is, with all the work that you're doing to help others, what is it that you want people to know most?
I want people to know that there's nothing wrong with them if they're struggling with their grief. I want them to know that that's normal, that there's nothing pathological about that their grief will take as long as it needs to. And what they need to do is welcome all those parts and find ways to take breaks because grief is really draining. I want people to know that grief is not hopeless, even if it's a huge loss, and that there are ways to reconstruct meaningful lives, even with enormous loss. One of my great heroes in life was Elie Wiesel, who lived through the Holocaust, lost every person he knew, became a therapist in the United States, and then a peace activist. So this was my inspiration for people who can go through really horrible things. And Elie Wiesel wrote a book about it called Night. So I'd read that. And it was like, how did he even get out of bed ever again after what we just read in that book? But
Sure.
he did, and then went on to be such a beacon of hope for the world. So we don't have to be Elie Wiesel and put that much pressure on ourselves, but we can build. I am another example of having lost arguably my favorite person in the world, um, certainly one of them, and then finding a way to be okay. So it's not hopeless. It's you will carry your grief with you for the rest of your life, but it doesn't have to be the focal point of your life, and you can build a meaningful life.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
You.
Okay, last question. If you could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and is uncertain on how or where to start, what would you say?
I would say be open to getting help. I think that one of the things that people make the mistake of doing is trying to bear their grief in isolation. So widen your circle of helpers as wide as you can. Don't fear social workers. There's a lot of them doing good grief work. Um, do detective work because I do understand that it's hard to get good help. Don't be afraid of working with students. Sometimes they're doing my students are doing phenomenal work with grief and loss and at low fees. Uh, and so there's a lot, hospices often offer free services. So my advice is just find the helpers. As Mr. Rogers would say, find the helpers.
That was great. Again, thank you. Thank you so much for this. I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to do this with you, especially the way we connected. You seeing
Go Birds!
my show and my interview with Dick. Exactly. Go Birds. um, I think that you have provided so much good information for so many people. And I think that this was a great opportunity to showcase IFS and all of its beauty and everything that it can do, especially integrating it with grief. So thank you for that. Um, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your story. And if someone wanted to find you online, or if they're interested in working with you, where can they find you?
They can find me at Healing Concepts LLC. .com. We are the one in Pennsylvania. I think there's two in the country. And we're always welcome to receive notes through the portal there. It'll send us a little email, and we're always happy to help. And Jalan, it's been such a pleasure. I'm so glad that I saw your Eagles jersey and decided to say hello. And I look forward to meeting you in person.
Likewise. Thank you so much for this. Thank you for the opportunity that you've given
My
me
pleasure.
to share what you do and your expertise and your knowledge. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it.
Thank you.